Today, we're going to be talking about what a biblical definition of love is. Love is something that is commonly redefined in our world right now, commonly in America, in the church, mainly among progressive Christians, and it is turned into something that it is simply not. It's redefined to mean all these worldly different things and outcomes, and it's turned into a bubbly feeling that you feel inside or simply a force. But we actually have a biblical definition of love given by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're going to look at a couple verses in that text, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and we're going to break down the definition of love that Paul gives, and we're going to talk about what it is and what it is not. So there's three verses we're going to highlight in this video. The first one, I want to actually jump down to verse 13, the very last verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It says, "Now abide faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love." That's something we cannot overlook. Love is actually greater than faith. Love is greater than hope. Love is of extreme importance in the life of a Christian. Now, if we go back to verse 1, Paul says, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." What he is saying here essentially is, it doesn't matter what his spiritual gift is, it doesn't matter what he can do, what he can understand. If he does not have love, if he lacks love in his heart and in his life as a Christian, he has missed the point. And then he goes on in verse 2 and he says, "And if I have all the faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing." That's something all of us need to realize and remember. If we lack love in our heart for our neighbor, for somebody else, for God, whoever it might be, we are nothing. We are missing the point. The two greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love fulfills the law, as Paul goes on to write in Romans. But I really want to focus in on verse 6. Verse 6 says, "It does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth." And here we go. This is where most people actually stray from the biblical definition of love itself. Love does not rejoice in unrighteousness. It does not rejoice in evil. It does not rejoice in sin or wickedness. It rejoices in truth. So there are many people who will say that if you call someone else out for their sin or something that they have in their life, you are not being loving. You are actually doing harm to them. That is what is commonly taught in, I'm not going to say all Protestant churches, definitely not really conservative churches, but progressive churches. And they gaslight Christians who are conservative with this. But the Bible says the exact opposite. It says we are to call out sin and unrighteousness. We are to go to a brother in love and tell them, hey, this is not God's will for your life. But before we do that, also as Jesus taught, we need to evaluate our own heart. We need to remove the log from our own eye, the plank from our own eye, before we go and try to remove the speck from our brother's eye. We have to make sure that when we call someone else out for something in their life, if it's sinful, whatever it might be, we have to make sure that our own lives are in check, that our heart is in check. I'm not saying we have to be sinless, okay? We will not be sinless here on this earth, but we need to make sure that whatever it is we are going to call them out for, that we are not ourselves doing. That would make us a hypocrite. Throughout the entire Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7, one of the major teachings of Christ amongst the different topics that he taught on was hypocrisy. You should not be a hypocrite. You cannot practice hypocrisy in your life. And we are allowed to judge. Many people will take that out of context as well and say that Christ taught we can never judge. If you look at the context of that chapter in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching, do not judge hypocritically. But when we leave someone in their unrighteousness, when we leave someone in their sin and we don't call it out and we don't warn them, we don't bring it up, we just ignore it, that is not loving. That is not a loving thing to do. The most loving thing as Christians, the most loving thing we can do is we can take the gospel message to the world and it convicts those who hear it. You are a sinner. You cannot save yourself. Only Jesus can do that. And he died on the cross for your sins so that you might be saved. That is the loving thing to do. Also with that, We don't continue on in sin. That's Romans chapter 6. Now that we are saved by grace through faith, we are not allowed to continue sinning. So the very sin that we were saved from, we should put off. We mortify the flesh. This is a true message of love. When you leave someone in their sin and you don't call it out, you are letting them practice something that actually hurts them. Even if they think that it's good for them, even if they enjoy it, even if they love it, whatever it might be, they are sinning against their soul, they are sinning against themselves, and they are sinning against God. And as Christians, we need to be more bold when it comes to calling this stuff out. But again, we have to evaluate our own heart. We have to see where we are at spiritually. We have to look at the own sin in our life before we call out the sin of others. If we don't, that is how we get labeled as hypocrites. That is how we get labeled, the modern label and the stereotype that you see around Christians. It is partially true that Christians are just hypocritical, judging, whatever, fill in the blank. All those labels that are placed on Christians, those are true for a reason. Stereotypes are true for a reason. They aren't just made up. But if we are truly going to be loving as Christians, we are going to have to do things that are uncomfortable. We are going to have to do things that make people upset. Telling them that something is not good for them will make them upset. We see that amongst many different sins that are common throughout the progressive church. I'm not going to start naming them, but I'll also say there's plenty of things within the just regular church who is conservative. There's plenty of sin there as well that needs to be called out that we just don't. For example, I'll give some examples. And this is something that I've noticed actually as I listen to more and more preaching from different churches and listen to different pastors. One common theme that I've noticed, and this is a whole nother video in itself, is that the church is so bold in calling out sin, but not specifically sins. So what I mean by that is the church is very bold in saying sin is bad, sin is not good, sin is crime against God. All of that is true. However, we're not calling out specific sins, and I think that would actually be more loving. For example, one of the sins that is not called out anymore that I see is the sin of gluttony, overeating. I'll be the first to admit, I like to eat. And sometimes I overeat, but I'm trying to recall the last time I ever heard a sermon on gluttony. But I think gluttony is something that is overlooked. It's not talked about. There are other sins within the conservative church that are just not spoken about anymore. And I just don't think that that is actually loving. We're just simply not called to stay in our comfort zone. That's actually not loving. We are called to go beyond that. We are called to call things out. Jesus, again, back in the Sermon on the Mount, he didn't say that you couldn't remove the speck from your brother's eye. He just said you need to make sure that the log is removed from your own eye first so that you are not a hypocrite. But calling out sin is loving. Again, love does not rejoice in unrighteousness. It rejoices in the truth. And leaving someone in their sin is not truth. And it's not love. And that is one of the ways that love is redefined in the church today. Thank you for tuning in to today's video. I hope it blessed you. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Let me know what you think about love in the comment section below, but we'll see you next time.